Okay, we're going to start your notes over feudalism in Japan. This is in chapter 19, section 3, and it starts on page 474 in your textbook. We're going to be talking about the feudal system in Japan and how it eventually leads to the shogunates, and we're going to talk about the Tokugawa shogunate and the use of gunpowder and the use of military technology and how this changed the fate of Japan. Okay, to give you a little background on Japanese feudalism, in the 1300s, a lot of the Japanese unity that had been created starts to crumble, and in 1467, a civil war comes in and basically shatters the Japanese feudal system. There was power struggle between the shoguns, which are the military leaders, and the territorial lords, and basically the entire power structure in Japan starts to crumble. All centralized power ends. During this time, it was a time known the Warring States period. Some powerful samurai are able to take control of some old feudal states, and they become the lords. They become what is known as the daimyo, or the warrior chieftain, and they offer peasants protection in return for their loyalty, and they set up what is known as this new type of feudalism, and it kind of gives way to a new type of feudalism in Japan. It is much like the European feudalism, in which they have lords that reside over the manors, and the peasants give them loyalty, but there's a few different things. By this time, the emperor simply is a figurehead. The emperor has no rule whatsoever. He pretty much has no political say. Eventually, and we're going to talk about this later on in your notes, the shogun, or the military leader, gets all the power, and the emperor just sits above him as a figurehead. So technically, the military leader is the one in charge. But during this time, the daimyo, they were building up armies. They had samurai for protection. They had their peasants working for them, and they would oftentimes fight against each other for territory. And there were even some of those daimyo that were very ambitious, and they wanted to fight for control of all of Japan. They wanted to become shogun. They wanted to unify Japan under one shogun. And there were some that were able to do that, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. There was one in particular who was able to do that, but there were several who paved the way for him to do that. This is the diagram. I know it's not great of the Japanese feudal system, but I really want you to be able to see this. On 475 in your textbook, there's also a diagram that's pretty good. Here at the top is the emperor. He's a figurehead, no political power, or some political power, mainly a religious figurehead with some political power and religious power, but mainly just a figurehead. Most of the power during this Japanese feudal system lies with the shogun, and he was the military leader. And we're going to talk about later on a very famous shogunate, which is kind of like the reign of the shogun, in just a minute. The daimyo are right here, right underneath the shogun. They probably could be up here with the shogun. They are very closely related. I know the diagram in your book kind of shows them as equals, but the shogun did have say over the daimyo. Under the daimyo is the samurai, who offered protection. They were loyal to the daimyo and the shogun, so they fought for the shogun and the daimyo. And down here are the peasants, and it makes up 4/5 of the population. The peasants were they're most of the population, but the lowest of the social class was not even shown here. It's the merchants. Japanese didn't look very highly on merchants, and they start out with they actually have the lowest social status. It's not on your diagram, but it is on the diagram in your book. Eventually they start to gain influence later, and we'll talk about that with the coming in of European merchants. But merchants are the powerful daimyo that wanted to be in charge. The first one who strove for that, his name was Oda Nobunaga. And Oda Nobunaga, this is his picture right here. He was able to take control of the capital at Kyoto, and his philosophy was that we should rule the empire by force. So basically, he crushed all of his enemies. He was able to crush rival daimyo who were trying to come up and take Japan. He also was able to shut down some of the Buddhist monasteries that were aligned with some of those rivals. He was very powerful. He even was able to use firearms for the first time efficiently in battle, and firearms came over from Europe during this time. So he was pretty powerful. However, he commits seppuku, which is just a ritual suicide of a samurai. It's something it's kind of an honorable death of a samurai because one of his generals turned on him. So he committed seppuku, and that would probably be a great thing if you're curious about that to further research. It was just a ritual that samurai went through. It was kind of like receiving an honorable death, getting to die a noble instead of having to die in battle or a coward. So after Oda Nobunaga dies, one of his most trusted generals named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, he wants to continue his mission. He wants to go ahead and try to unify Japan just like Nobunaga tried to do. He was able to unify some of Japan. He was able to control most of the Japan's country. He really didn't want to stop with Japan, though. He wanted to expand and go into China. So he invaded Korea, and he began to try and overthrow the Koreans who were allies with the Chinese. However, in battle with the Chinese and the Koreans, he dies and his troops withdraw. So he's not able to do that, but he had high ambitions for Japan to expand into Korea and eventually into China. So after Hideyoshi dies, probably the most influential shogun takes power. Like I said, shogun just means military leader. And the shogun by the name of Tokugawa Ieyasu. And we're going to keep saying Tokugawa. That was the family name. And Ieyasu, he was the first of the Tokugawa shoguns. And he basically completed the unification. So the two daimyo before, Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, they were able to contribute to the unification, but Tokugawa Ieyasu, he completes it. He completes the unification of Japan, and he is able to gain the loyalty of the daimyo in Japan. So the daimyo now submit to him. He becomes emperor of Japan, or shogun. That's the word. He creates an alternate attendance policy. This policy is really important. It contributed to being able to establish a centralized government. An alternate attendance policy basically required all the daimyos, all the lords, to go live at the capital, which was Edo, and that is modern-day Tokyo. They had to live there every other year so that he could monitor their behavior, make sure that they were loyal to the state. But one catch was, once they went back to their land, they had to leave their families at Edo. So basically, the shogunate, or the shogun, was able to have complete control over the daimyo to make sure they were loyal. And this really reestablished the idea of centralized government in Japan. We talked about earlier in these notes that the centralized government had really fallen apart. Japan was not unified. However, under Ieyasu, they were very unified because of this, contributing to the alternate attendance policy. He established the Tokugawa shogunate. He was the first one, and the theme of the Tokugawa shogunate, he dies on his deathbed. He tells his son, take care of the people, strive to be virtuous, never neglect to protect the country. And when he dies, his son, Hidetada, comes and takes over. So that's, Ieyasu is the first of the Tokugawa shogunates, or shoguns. The shogunate is the kingdom of the shogun. Under Ieyasu and all the Tokugawa shoguns, culture really strives. Food production was high, the population was really high, the merchant class started to gain a lot in wealth. This caused Japan to shift from a rural culture to an urban culture. Peasants started to see the merchant class get rich. They started to see they wanted to escape taxes, so they started to move to the cities. The cities were growing much larger, becoming very commercial, and this contributed a lot to Japan becoming a very large city. Edo, which is modern day Tokyo, I believe, even had up to 1 million people. So it came up to be the largest city in the world at the time. So that was very, very large, and that was a big thing for Japan. Also, their art and their drama. The nobility would watch these no dramas, and those had the tragic themes. But the people of the city, the common people would watch kabuki drama, and that had more urban and common themes. And if you guys know, the kabuki drama is when they put all the white makeup on and they do the drama and they act out a play. And those had more traditional themes than the no dramas. Also, the haiku. A haiku is just a poem. It presents images instead of tells a story. And I know you guys have heard of that through your English classes, but it's just a grouping of words together that presents images instead of a poem that would tell a story like an epic poem. Okay, in Japan, Europeans start to come and make contact with the Japanese, much like they did with the Indians and the Mughal Empire. The first thing they do, they come to trade. Europeans wanted to trade. Portuguese sailors brought clocks, eyeglasses, tobacco, firearms. We saw when Nobunaga, he introduces firearms in battle. And the musket was really important because it reduced the power of the samurai. The American or the European musket reduced the power of the samurai, and it caused a lot of problems because the samurai no longer had as much power. Firearms were coming into effect. Missionaries were coming over, trying to convert to Christianity. The Jesuits, the Franciscans, and the Dominicans, the orders of the Catholic Church that came around during the Catholic Reformation, they were coming over to convert. They kind of scorned the local politics because they were seeking out converts. So eventually, Tokugawa Ieyasu, he drives the Christians out. He bans Christianity. Another thing that causes Christianity to get banned is some samurai in the south, mainly made up of Christians, caused a rebellion, and so the shogun renounces Christianity as the cause of the rebellion, so Christianity is renounced. But Europeans start to make contact with the Japanese. Because of the European ideas and the European ways that were coming in, many of the leaders did not like it. They were very upset by it. Some of the Christianity, they were renouncing Christianity. They didn't like the new things they were bringing in. The musket was weakening the power of the samurai class. So in 1639, Japan issues a closed country policy, and that's just a policy of isolationism. Isolationism just means that they're closed off from the outside world. They're sealed, their borders are sealed. They're isolated from everything else. And so this just sealed the borders to outsiders. Only one port remained open, but only the Chinese and the Dutch were allowed in. And this stayed in effect for the next 200 years. And Japanese culture was able to be preserved, and they were able to develop as a self-sufficient country. They were free from the Europeans trying to colonize and establish a country there, which we will see a lot going into World War I, that European countries try to colonize, set up colonies, and Japan really didn't want that to happen. So they established the closed country policy because of these new ideas and these new ways that were coming into their country that they didn't necessarily like. Make sure, write down any questions that you have. Make sure you have written down good information. Bring it to class with you the next time we meet, and I will see you next time.